it is your buddy, Peace and Harmony with you here today. Much love going out to all the beautiful empowered harmonizers. We are zooming in and focusing in today on a great viewer question, and that is, how do you get up enough bravery, enough gall, enough confidence, enough trust in self, basically to confront a covert narcissist, someone who has been manipulative. Perhaps this has been going on for years and years and decades. How do you basically get to a space where you can then stand your ground and confront them and communicate them coming from a new perspective? And so we're going to go into this in fairly in depth, really in terms of how you do that shift, of awareness, that shift into freedom. Basically, as Lack Kelly in his book, Shift into Freedom, describes as releasing ego identification. So when we talk about confronting anyone who has been in an unsavory relationship with us that has been fraught with abuse, it could be physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, all the various sundry forms of manipulation that have caused you to feel helpless, to feel powerless in the circumstance, in the relationship, in that pocket and area of your life. And furthermore, depending on what stage of your life that this occurred on, it really is formative, and to the extent that it will overlap into other areas of your life, your relationships, your employment, and how you have self-reference, how you refer to and relate to yourself, the type of feelings you feel on a day-to-day basis. It's not just, feeling good, once a year. It's really how you feel on a daily basis. And really, and how then you then navigate your relationships, how you're able to communicate with self, how you're then able to communicate with others and either confront things that are going on, or do you just ignore them? Do you just begin to take sides with people? Do you begin to, side with the one who's most popular, who's tallest, who's, seems to have the most powerful? Who do you align yourself with? And the problem when it really becomes to how to confront, address, communicate with others is the fact that you've been plagued by a sense of worry in your communication style. And worry basically means the feeling of impending doom. You're preparing for the worst. You're preparing for doomsday. You're going to end up disappointed. Things aren't going to go your way. So this is the natural inclination and rumination of the mind. Meaning, because bad things have happened to you before, they're going to continue. In other words, you're feeling in that automatic mindset, like automatic pilot, history is doomed to repeat itself. So this feeling, this physiology, this neurochemistry, and then the behaviors and choices that emanate from that are the feeling of then, powerlessness. In other words, history is doomed to repeat itself and things are just going to continue. So because this has happened before, it's going to happen again, and there is no intervention. There is no breaking of the cycle. The mind in the neurochemistry will tend to repeat itself and then become addicted to and create, even despite the presence of that perpetrator, the trigger, it'll tend to perpetuate that same neurochemical environment, leading to the feeling of worry, preparing for doomsday. It's, here we go again. It's the same relationship patterns. It's the same fights. It's the same events. Things are going to happen again. It's the dysfunction perpetuating itself. And so it's to understand that really this is then what is known as basically ego identification, or referencing yourself in this matrix or this puzzle, this this exact web, if you will, of relationships, and then really the universe at large. So it spreads out into then your perspective and how you feel, your physiology about how you handle situations and whether you're able to address them truthfully, in fairness, and without this ego identification of the less than self, the ego identification of being the victim, the ego identification of being a scapegoat. So it is to understand that when you've been scapegoated, sabotaged, the target of chronic criticism, is to understand that this is then becomes your ego identification, how you reference yourself as it relates to that situation. For example, if you were the director in 10 movies, you would have an ego identification of I'm a director. In other words, you're used to people, relating to you in that manner because it's repeated in what you've done daily. It's how you've built and defined yourself. Now, when it becomes, against your free will, and, you're always perhaps cast as the extra, or you're not cast at all, this then relates to a feeling of helplessness and powerlessness. It matches a lower vibration. It matches a lower shift of energy. It can match that of anxiety, PTSD. It's the feeling of fearfulness. Things aren't going to go your way. It's the perpetuation of the neurochemicals that are then in a propulsion, if you will, and then the thoughts then tend to magnify and perpetuate. And so really people then end up having an ego identification with this, which is then akin to imprisonment or being around people who are the troublemakers, the people who are the saboteurs, the people who put you in the lower than position. And so, of course, we discuss here how important it is and how profoundly educational and profoundly self-enhancing it is to go no contact to the perpetrators and the violators in your life, because you're able to get out of that ego identification with them naming you as such. In other words, keeping that role in play, keeping that ball into motion, keeping that feeling that you are the less than. It is the reference. In other words, they're not letting it go. It's like a grudge that is never released. They're holding on to it. And then it is to understand that the narcissist, or someone who is an emotional manipulator, they're always playing on people's emotions, until things change, until they're either shaken up or they have, apology for what they have done. Is to understand that they're going to perpetuate and increase the gap. They're going to continue to perpetuate this gap that, you are not as good as. There's a constant comparison in order to protect their ego. It is all about the ego. It's all about the ego reference of how they are status referred to in this ego reality. But that's not the ultimate. It's in other words, it's saying you're more than your title. You're more than what you eat. You're more than where you live. You're more than what you drive. So all these are the trappings of the ego. So you are more than that. The Shifting to Freedom is a very kind of intensive book. And it's really, it's very important for people, like myself, who have really studied this in depth and for, several decades. It is to understand and put this into layman terms, the ego. If you hear someone, they have a big ego, they have a powerful ego, they have, and this can be different from charisma. So I want you to understand the difference and how to understand that when you release ego identification, it can help you to communicate with these, and release the blocks and really be able to confront and handle, these characters in your life, and they're not the dominators over you. It's to understand that they bank on and are basically winning the match, winning the set, that they are going to dominate you in some sort of reference of status, of reference of power, of position. So this is all ego based. In other words, it's all, when you think about someone who has a big ego, it's all about, what they have done. It's not, it's the trappings of success. It's, it's the external objects that they might own, the assets, etc. So they, you hear about someone who has a big ego, but you can also talk about someone who has a strong charisma or aura. In other words, it's not what they're wearing, it's the energy that's emanating from them. And that is going to be your truth and your liberation, is when you begin to look at and release ego identification with these trauma bonding relationships, because it's the ego identification, it's again how you compare, that's keeping you locked and blocked, and your aura is coming off as meek or weak or timid. You're not able to communicate with the clarity and command the room or command the position or command the communication. It becomes very difficult to communicate on equal levels when you're feeling an ego identified with, the lesser self, and versus the greater self. The large capital I am, the S capital S self, which is connected to source. It's a God-given inalienable connection that you are a human being, and thus you are connected to source. You are connected, and I'm not trying to cause this to sound woo-woo, but you are connected to divine intelligence. In other words, this is your birthright. You didn't have to earn it. It's not ego-based. So it's not locked and blocked in that big ego. In other words, you can be someone of great charisma and have an aura that is permeating, a radiance, and the electric magnetic energy, that is coming off of you, which is very peaceful, which causes people to get along, or people, you turn heads because of your aura. It is to understand that someone of this is not trapped in the ego. And so that oftentimes is what gets people's attention. It's like, the movie star that marries this other person, and who is not a movie star. And you're like, wow, this person could have anybody. What was it that attracted them? Perhaps it wasn't their wealth. It wasn't their ego. It wasn't their trappings of success or what they've done. It was who they are energetically, their perspective, how they looked at things. They're beautiful on the inside. So that is, an example. I want you to kind of get a difference in understanding of, how different energies and how they play in relationships. And so it's to become and acknowledge that, and to not become intimidated by the ego, because it's the intimidation that sets you up into this mindset of the ego identification, if you will, the role identification, if you will, the you have labeled me, if you will. So it's to say that you're bringing that into your relationships, you're bringing that into your life. You're not giving yourself a chance to purge this and release this and out of your physiology. So you need to get out of that naming of all names. In other words, to understand, and this is pretty advanced when you get to this state, it's really what a lot of people might call enlightenment or bliss or nirvana, and it's not something that's going to take you, years and years to get. It's not something that's going to take years and years for you to live by. It's to understand, to have to be able to come back enough and have the allowingness, the openness enough to understand that everything that you might have held dear in your life, which is that of ego identification, can be released. In other words, it's to release it and to not clutch and hold on and not to have that attachment. It's what is known perhaps in Buddhism or other philosophies as non-attachment. In other words, it's the release that gives you the giving. It's you receive in the releasing. It's kind of like a juxtaposition or an oxymoron, like you hear of the the freezing hot or the jumbo shrimp. It's really kind of like in the releasing you receive. And so in the releasing of that ego identification, it is all that judgment. In other words, you could be judged as something in one society. If you go to another country, you just are. You're a human being. You're experiencing that foreign land. You're looking at the exotic buildings, the exotic landscape, eating the exotic foods, or what have you, looking at how the different governments are run up, and you're an observer. You've released, and you're taking in, you're perhaps still assimilating based on your history, but you're broadening your perspective. In other words, it's in the letting go, and you're making room within, and you're then allowing new perspectives, experiences, and then you're not so narrow-minded. You're not so caught up in the ego identification. You're becoming traveled, you're becoming cultural, you're gaining wisdom. And so you don't have to go to a Buddhist monastery to release the ego identification, to release your victim mentality. It's to understand that this was put in place in your life like a matrix, like a puzzle. In other words, it was created, and you have learned to feel meek. You have learned to feel fearful. This is a learned state. You have learned this. So it's not so much in the learning how to deal, it's the unlearning. It is the unlearning that I am less than. It's the unlearning that I am powerless. It's the unlearning that I can't communicate. It's the unlearning that I don't deserve. It's the unlearning of the negative validation. And so it's almost like you have to let go. And if you really look at it on a grand scape, you can just see that as what is created by man. In other words, look at something greater, which is the divine intelligence, which has created the oxygen, which has created the symbiotic, relationship between water and life, sunlight and life. This was not man-made. This is divinely orchestrated. And it is to understand that this divine orchestration is what is running through you 24/7. You don't have to ask, hey, can I be identified with the divine intelligence? You can ask that, but you already are. So it is to understanding that when you lift yourself up, literally it's a heightened perspective. You might call it nirvana or bliss. It's to realize that everything that has been put into play, has been put into play by this divine intelligence for your own good, but it's to also realize that what has been put into play by the lower than, by the man-made. In other words, almost look at it as a man-made design or matrix, and that all the definition of good, bad, ugly, etc. is based in that. It is based in that ego identification. So when you remove that, all of a sudden suffering is released. If you have had ego identification with suffering, it's because you put value in this and then not the divine wisdom. It's not your source connection. You have been unliberated. You have learned to feel caught up and trapped. So it is to understand, and this might take you a while to really get it. It might take you a while to really see this, but it's to understand that this suffering oftentimes is perpetuated in emotion by this ego identification. So then taking the courage to release and let go, to allow and receive. So today you might tell yourself, it is in the letting go that I receive. Letting go of the fear that I receive the confidence. It's letting go of the ego identification of I'm not into the I am. And then it's to allow a new sense of confidence, a new sense of appreciation of that which is the magnificent, the magical, the mystical, which is actually running like a golden thread through your life, that has always been there, but it's time now to become more awake to it. In other words, to give it some attention. And begin, how do you do that? So how do you get confidence in order to stop, to put your hand up and say, you know what, stop. Stop. It's to get, how do you learn the body language? How do you use the nonverbal communication? It is to understand that communication is largely nonverbal. In fact, linguists will profess that basically 75% of communication is nonverbal, and only a very, very small amount is then verbal. It's oftentimes the tone which is responsible for communicating. In other words, the tone of a piano, the tone of church bells, the tone of a singing bell, the tone of crystal. All these are, tones that are communicative. And so it's to understand also that your communication is oftentimes nonverbal. So knowing that to be the case, you have to work on your nonverbal communication. Are you, wound up? Are you hunched over? Is your body, very downcast? Look at your physiology and pay attention to how your body is standing on a day-to-day basis, how you are sitting. Are you crunching up your shoulders? Are you curving your shoulders in? Or are they out and receptive and heart-led? Are you sitting in downcast? Are you always looking down? Or are you ever looking up? Looking at the sky, looking at the tallest branches, noticing, and then with that becomes an uplifted feeling. Do you smile? Smiling will help to lift this timid feeling when you are communicating. So it is to work really on the releasing the ego identification that has that non-verbal communication tied to it, where you're always in that, you're like a cow in a small, you're all pent up. Look at where you're pent up. Pay attention to your physiology and how are you limiting, and how does your body react to specific situations, colors, words. Begin to pay attention and tune into you, because that is where the power is. That's how you release the powerlessness, is to identify with that power within you, which is within you, and you become sensitive to and desensitized to that ego matrix that's telling you, you're not, and then identifying you with the roles, the labels, and releasing that. It's like in the great book, Tao Te Ching, it's that which cannot be named. So you're identifying with that which cannot be named. In other words, it's so powerful, it's so omnipotent, the human mind is not even worthy of naming it. In other words, when you get to that level, in fact, that's a very appropriate identification, is that which cannot be named. In other words, it is your connection to source, Jesus, energy, Savior energy, the Messiah. It is connection to that, but inviting more of that in, and you do that on a percentage basis. In other words, you cannot simultaneously be attached to a victim mentality and be like a victor. In other words, energetically, you can't be attached to the problem, and make that, and associate. In other words, you can't simultaneously hang out with the wrong crowd, the troublemakers, getting yourself into trouble, and redeem and save yourself. I mean, it just is not going to work. You need to surround yourself with that which is bringing you joy, and then helping you to release that which is named, that ego identification, which has hitherto imprisoned you, and becoming more sensitized to the inner sensations of yourself. Take a moment and pay attention to how your body reacts to certain things. For example, let's just do a quick small test before we wrap it up. And this will help you to speak the words. This will help you to be able to communicate, because you're coming from a positive, divine, I deserve space. It is to look at how you react to certain things. When you say the word darkness, how does that make you feel? When you say the word sunrise, how does that make you feel? When you say the word rainbow, how does that make you feel? when you say the word dark, heavy clouds, how does that make you feel? Or when you imagine these things? It's to understand that you can bring these things into conscious awareness and then affect and control how you feel. So I want you to kind of play around with this. I mean, instead of, doing something passive, watching TV, not doing, kind of not improving your mind, like W. Clement Stone watching The Electric Income Reducer, as he calls the TV, begin to, he wrote the book, The Power of Positive Thinking. He was a great purveyor in Aon and insurance. And, he was a really mastermind. I mean, a brilliant thinker, a great achiever. But he really, and he was a great, developed a lot of foundations. W. Clement Stone, The Power of Positive Thinking. And as it's not, the power of negative victim identification. As you can see, juxtaposition, it is a different state. It is available to all, but will you claim this? Will you take ownership? Will you liberate yourself from that dynamic and just say, this power is mine. I literally am a creator. This power, this joy, this communication of what I want, this clarity is mine. And I'm able to communicate and say no. I'm able to put up my hand and say stop. I have go-to new moves physiologically, which I'm able to call upon on my physiological repertoire, my physical repertoire, which then helps you to communicate your boundaries and standards and your respective self and what you deserve when hitherto you were not able. So it's releasing the ego identification with the less than, the scapegoated. It's seeing that was built in and learned in a matrix of sorts. If you don't understand the word matrix, you can research on what that means. Basically, in other words, it's a learned design. In other words, it's how your role is produced by that. So it is to understand that all the fear, the anxiety, the timidity was learned, and it's the unlearning. So become attentive to how you can unlearn those fearful and then become safe and feeling empowered in a whole different vibration physiologically. And then develop your repertoire of how you protect that and how you communicate that. Stop. This is a way to be assertive. People who have been codependent or who have had a lot of flying monkeys in their life. I know we have a lot of viewers who have had people who have had, they're getting communicated with these other people, so they're like tangents, spokespeople, if you will, figureheads of this narcissist that are still in their life. And how do you keep them at bay? If they're still in your life, that is a choice. You have to realize that is a choice that you have made, but you must learn to live with it and not just cope with it. But a way to live with it is to understand, am I coping or am I living? Begin to ask yourself these questions and begin to see how you answer in response. So it's to understand, how do you become assertive? Stop. Whoa. Hold it. Wait. That's not going to work. And then putting your hand up is a way to help assert your boundaries. And it's, like almost like a crossing guard. You're able to communicate, but you need to have that physiologically felt within. No, no to the drink, no to the drugs, no to the whatever that, is tempting you to feel less than, and to look squarely in the eyes or squarely above the eyes to the eyebrow or to the ear. If you are so intimidated that you can't have eye contact, then you deliver the message to the eyebrows or to the forehead. Where you don't look down, you look right above the eyebrows and you deliver your message. So your gaze is, created. You are helping to create a feeling of empowerment, and you're able to cast off those flying monkeys, as they say. It's a very popular term. And then you're also look at when you smile and how you can deliver your communication with a smile. basically means you are so healed. You can deliver the message with confidence, a smile. You are there. You're at that sort of enlightened state that I'm connected to that divine orderly. In other words, I'm engaged in that positive orderly thinking with repetition and experience to the point that I have learned how to take command, and I've unlearned the meek, the weak. I no longer wear that label whatsoever. It does not fit. It's like a pair of shoes that's too small. It ain't fitting on the body. I ain't wearing a size 5. I have grown out of that. So it's to understand that liberation is when you disidentify and demystify how you got stuck in the matrix and realize it is just the matrix. But when you really look at it, you have an awareness that is above and beyond and gives you empowerment to deal and, basically come through joyfully and a winner, a victor. But it doesn't mean that there's a loser. It just means that it is. It is a positive B state, and then more synchronicities begin to become attracted to you, to saying, hey, we're here. The divine is working in your life. This is your buddy. Peace and harmony with you here today, and I hope that these videos do help. Please share and please subscribe for more great tools, videos, discussion, and support. Peace out. Love you.